Have you ever felt like an imposter? Many of us deal with imposter syndrome because we feel like we are not capable as others think we are, like we're somehow a fraud. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and today I have the joy of talking with the very authentic and very funny Jenni Clayville. She candidly shares about the time she was going to take a secret of hers to the grave.
Well, why can't they just get it? Why can't she get over it? Why can't he just get over it? I'm like, you kind of messed the whole thing up. Like, you can't just expect them to trust you immediately because you've not built any walls of trust back up for them, right? And so that's the one thing, like integrity, you either have it or you don't. It's not like a sliding scale. So once you lose it, it's so much hard to build it back. But when you've built it back, you better work really hard to not mess it up again.
Here's my conversation with Jenni Clayville. Well, Jenni Clayville, welcome to the Propel podcast. You are a tremendous speaker. I think you're super funny.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you are a wife and a mom to two boys, but I would love to know, what was Jenni like at 8, 9 years old?
You know what? Growing up, for me, just, I'm American-born Chinese. And so I didn't know if I really felt like I belonged anywhere as a child. So I am just a younger version of myself. I think it kind of grew me into who I am today, trying to figure out how to read the room, being in a room and feeling like I'm the only person, one, being a minority, but then also being a female, oftentimes in the room. That was kind of what it felt like even as a kid, isolated, alone. And I think that's a lot of people. Even if you're not alone, you have a tendency to feel that. There's just like a lot of imposter syndrome. And I'm seeing it more and more with kids, the younger they are. I don't think social media helps it either. So it just tells us what we're supposed to be like, but that's not like a real thing, right? We were created to be different and not just like everybody else. So yeah, I think when I was 8, it was just more, I don't really know what life is, what's coming. And I don't know what life is supposed to be lived out like as a kid.
When you were younger, was Jesus a part of your life, or is that something that came later down the road?
Yeah. So my mom and dad were not Christians. They moved here from Hong Kong. And so they were immigrants, but my dad fought in the Vietnam War for America. So it's interesting, like just the dynamics of that, but they lived here. And my mom started going to church when I was 3. My godmother at the time kept inviting her, and she finally said, yeah, let's do it. And she went and she accepted Jesus as her very own when I was around 3 and started taking us to church. And so I don't really remember a life without going to church, all of the good and the bad with it. And so I would say my faith has always played a part in my life. And by the time I was 8, there were a lot of assumptions that I had made with my faith. And then, of course, as time went on, I kind of grew into it a little bit more.
Have you seen some of those maybe core feelings that you had as a child play a role into what you're doing now? It's a part of who you are. And so it gives you like such passion to involve that into ministry and beyond.
Yeah, I do think that I naturally lean toward people that are marginalized, the fringe, the outskirts, people that don't have all the resources that we may have. I am incredibly privileged. I have a lot to be grateful for. I have an amazing husband. I have 2 great kids. We have everything we need and really actually want. And I know that's not the case for everyone. I wouldn't say we were in poverty, but we were not wealthy. And we definitely had enough where my mom and dad, they divorced when I was 7. But I remember my mom choosing specific things that would help propel us forward in life. And so we had enough to invest in those things for us. And we always had a meal, but it didn't mean we could pick what the meal was, So I'm very grateful that we were always taken care of, but we didn't really get the things that we always wanted or necessarily needed in the American standard for school and stuff like that. And so I want to be able to help shift where people have resources. Let's share that kind of across where people don't have those opportunities or options. So I've seen that kind of play into it a little bit more. And I think there's also a spiritual poverty that I grew up with. My mom, though she was saved, she wasn't like, we all were human. We all have disconnect and such. But my father, he didn't become a Christian until right before he passed away. So there was a lot of years in there that you kind of just wondered, okay, we're missing a big chunk of something that's super, super important, which is really God's presence, inviting God's presence into our lives.
I can't imagine, to have that dynamic of a kid trying to figure out faith. You have a mom who believes and then just kind of questioning. But I also feel like maybe it gave you a perspective too of, sometimes people need a little bit more, and just to see, like, it gives you perspective. Like, not everyone is just ready to believe right away. And so I'd be curious, has that helped you better understand people's faith and knowing that sometimes waiting is very challenging? It's very hard, especially for those we love. What was that like for you?
I kind of got hit upside the head when my father passed away 6-7 years ago. And we would pray before we would eat, and he would make jokes like, you should just pray to me because I'm providing this meal. Just being smart aleck, right? And I remember as a adolescent, as a child, I would say, like, that's just heresy. That's ridiculous, Dad. But what was crazy is like seeing my dad shift into a place, I really had given up hope, I think. And I think a lot of us give up hope because we are living this life out, processing life out in our timeline. And so what feels like a long time to us is really just a blink of an eye for God. And so when I'd given up hope on my dad, and I remember he had cancer and he was on his deathbed in the hospital, and one of his friends who is a pastor in Hong Kong actually went up to his bed, and my sister and I were standing off to the side, and he just talked to my dad, like, to the very end. And here I am, I'm a pastor. And I was just like, this is a lost cause. And this man just poured into him, and my dad prayed the prayer with him. And I remember feeling a sense of incredible gratitude. And my sister and I were just crying. And I thought to myself, oh man, just the shame in myself of giving up. And what gave me the right to give up on someone that God created in his own image and loves him more than I would ever love him. And I just gave up. And so it was a good reminder from that point on. And I would say that shifted some of what I believe now, especially in the Western Christian faith. We have this timeline and this control and these absolutes. There's so much dualism of like black and white, right and wrong. And there is no space for what's inside that spectrum. And so I live in that spectrum, in that gray a little bit more now, trusting most of the time, trying to trust that God has got it and that I just don't see what he sees. But this was an incredible lesson learned for me.
Well, what a beautiful moment too, it kind of represents like Christ in our life. Like sometimes we try to do everything. I've given you all these chances, Dad. I've tried to pour this into you. And at the last moment, God just reminds us sometimes we can't do it on our own and we desperately want to. But what a beautiful moment to witness that too, to feel all the feelings, but to then know that your dad had that moment with that gentleman. So that was awesome. Jenni, for those of you that don't, for those listening that don't know you, can you tell a little bit about who you are, what you do day to day?
Well, like I said, I'm Chinese American, first generation here, and I am a pastor. I am not a pastor's wife. My husband is not a pastor. There's more and more of us, but I remember, I've been a pastor, I've been in ministry for over 20 years now. And so I remember when I first started not seeing much of that around. There were women in ministry, but they weren't necessarily lead pastors or pastors at all. I saw a lot of like the amazing Beth Moore. We saw a lot of that, but they were writing devotionals at that time, or like a Darlene Check who was leading worship. But yeah, so I remember seeing stuff like that. And I was 14 or 15, and my mom asked me, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I had already felt this huge calling in my life. But like, here's the thing, like I'd never seen a woman in ministry, right? And so I said, I thought the only way I could do ministry was become a pastor's wife. So I said, I want to become a pastor's wife. And here we are, fast forward how many years, and I am not a pastor's wife, but I'm a pastor. And so I work, and we live in the Washington D.C. area. We live in Fairfax, Virginia. And in this area, I work at National Community Church, and I'm one of the pastors at the Northern Virginia location. And so that's what I get to do. I kind of oversee all the weekend experience stuff. Anything that happens on a Sunday morning, I oversee that and oversee the teams that do that. And unfortunately have team members that are just brilliant and just way better at me than what I do. So I'm just grateful for that.
It's always great great to have a team. Does your husband go by pastor's husband?
He's like, I didn't sign up for this, but I'm for you. Let's do it. So
that's awesome. That's so great that he is supportive of you. Jenni, have you ever felt, we connected at a women's conference and we were talking about women in ministry. Have you ever felt, when you were talking also about imposter syndrome, just the need to prove yourself as a pastor, as someone in ministry? Because one, you're a woman, you're also Chinese American. Do you feel the need to showcase that?
Oftentimes, yes. I mean, I'm also an Enneagram 3. So the imposter syndrome's like super real for me. Hey, right? So I think what is helpful for me though, is I'm aware of those feelings. And what scripture has said time and time again is that we were created for a purpose, and we're created very specifically the way we're created. We were wonderfully made, right? And so I have to look at what scripture says and compare it to what I believe of myself. And there's one of these things that are fallible, right? And so I have to remind myself that my feelings, and to be fair, I probably have less feelings than a normal person. I have feelings. I know I have feelings, but they don't necessarily manifest in emotion. I just kind of go, what was that? And so, I'm working on it. I'm trying to get more in touch with myself. But like, honestly, I just feel like most of the time I am telling myself lies, or I take what someone else has said and they don't really mean it, and I've shifted it into something bigger. Now, there are times people have said things to me that are cruel and inappropriate and mean, and I have to figure out which parts of those are, okay, that is something I need to address, and this is something I don't have to address. And so there's wisdom and discernment in that as well. But yeah, to answer your question, Danielle, all the time. I feel it all the time. And I just have to remember that I'm still called. And so what does that mean in spite of all those feelings within myself?
I mean, I think that's so good, because when I look at you, I watch you on YouVersion. I've seen you on stage, and I'm just like, wow. We can easily say, this girl, she has it together. She's just, cute. She's saying the word of God. And then you can say, yeah, I deal with imposter syndrome too. I think that just helps us. And that's why I think stories matter so much to me, and why that matters in community and in friendship and relationships, because it helps us understand each other, be more empathetic, and understand there are so much more ways that we are alike than we realize. So, Jenni, I'd love to ask you, what is one of your parable stories that you'd like to share with us today?
Yeah. So, man, there's so much that's kind of gone on in my life. I think the biggest thing, the most life-changing part, which when you think of a parable, it's something that kind of is a story. It could be big, it could be small, but it's something that kind of shifts your life and kind of changes the trajectory of your life. So for me, and this is not a private story, it's pretty public, but 18 years ago, I chose to have an affair. I was in ministry, and, so often people are like, oh, I don't even know how I fell into that. And I would say, yeah, you know how you fell into it. You know what you did. You just don't want to look at it and actually take the ownership. And so I really had to look at that and go, what does that mean for my life? Because I was in ministry at the time, and there was a lot of stuff. I went to a lot of counseling, did a lot of coaching, and really invested myself in this area of figuring out why, because there is always a root issue. And we can chalk it up to, it's that God-shaped hole. Okay, that's really like super religious. And even though it's true, that helps nobody, right? And here's the reality for me is there were all these pieces. Like, my parents divorced when I was 7. My mom, though she tried her best as a single mom, she didn't do a great job. She was pretty abusive. I had insecurity issues in myself. I didn't see myself. Like I told you earlier, I felt like I was imposter everywhere I went. And so there was a lot of just isolation in my own mind. And so how all these pieces played into it without it getting dealt with was, for me, it manifested in an affair. Now, sometimes for other people, it can manifest in drug use. It manifests itself in self-abuse, self-mutilation, all those different things that we actually are seeing more and more in post-COVID, post-pandemic, right? And so there's a lot of grace for people in my heart. I look at that, and I will say, like, so often people are like, oh, once a cheater, always a cheater. And there's always this narrative too, from Genesis, from the beginning of time, of Eve did this to us. Never mind that in the original text, it says he was with her. So, we have this kind of weird narrative in our mind. And I had that in my own mind. And so long story short really is I confessed my affair to my husband. It was an affair that lasted almost 2 years. And I say 2 years as in from the minute that, not physically, but like the minute I had emotionally kind of left my marriage vows to the day that I confessed. And there was a good year in there that nothing was happening, but I had decided I was going to go to the grave without telling my husband. And a lot of different things kind of came into play, but I realized, no, like I need to be real. I need to be honest. Like I missed feeling God in the fullness of who he was in my life because I had this big old wall. So yeah, I would say that was a huge part. We did a lot of work. We did a lot of marital counseling and did the hard work. I would never say that we are healed because I don't ever want people to think, oh, there's always a beautiful bow on all of our stories and we're done. It is a choice to continue to do the work. And so I would always rather have a healthy marriage over a good marriage. And a healthy marriage doesn't always mean everything's smooth and clean. It means that you are grappling with things, that you are working through things, that you're talking through things. And I mean, you shouldn't be fighting all the time, but you should be able to have the skills to have, a conversation. And you should be able to disagree with each other freely, but then love regardless at the end. So yeah, it definitely, like this affair, usually when you think of affair, especially now, I'm just really grateful that this all happened before social media, the whole canceling of cultures, because I would have for sure been canceled, and I should have been, truly, but God's grace is bigger than all of this. So I'm super, super grateful of getting a second chance and getting to see people in a space that was similar to mine. And maybe it's not manifested the same way, but where they feel like God has taken them, or they've been taken out and now God can't use them. And that's just not true. Like God, if you look at every single character in the Bible, they're all completely dysfunctional. And even King David, he was so loved by God, but we look at King David and we're like, man, he was a murderer, adulterer. He was all the things, right? And so how do we look at that and go, we can still have a relationship with God?
Jenni, thank you for sharing that. That is a big part of somebody's life. I would be curious, you had to go and share that with your husband, but you also had to recognize that for yourself. And you said you were going to take it to the grave. What was it like for you to reconcile with yourself?
Man, that's a pretty heavy question, because I think at the time I would have answered differently. At the time, I was willing to lose it all for a good reason. I was trying to save my marriage by being honest, but I was also fully ready that this was not going to go. I had never seen a marriage up to this point make it after an affair, which is why I kept it locked up for so long. But in hindsight today, I think what I see is God wanted to restore something that looked unrestorable. So I think I'm just so stubborn in my ways. I'm very much one of those people forever that were like very black and white. It's this way or that way. I do remember, this is what's ridiculous. I do remember telling my husband when we first got married, I'm like, if you cheat on me, I'm leaving you. What an idiot. I'm such an idiot. So, I mean, here's the thing, right? I'm the one who's saying these things, but the reality is that there's so much more to the story. There's so much more to the picture. And what God wanted me to learn in hindsight is that I, one, have zero control. And two, I had zero grace. Here I am, a pastor, living my life out in ministry because I knew I was called, and I had no grace for people. And when you have a fall this big and it's like moral depravity, and you shouldn't like get out of this in any way, shape, or form. I should not be in ministry today. The fact that I am, and my story is pretty public out there, that shows a greater calling that's outside of myself. And so for me, it just is relieving because it's not about me. It's not about my control. Now I have a choice in all of this, how I invest in myself, how I pour into myself, how much time I give myself rest to lament things as they're happening. I'm trying to be like a whole human. But in the end, it's not about what I can do. It's about who God is.
I think there's so many times, and I remind myself, because I think in the beginning of marriage, I would say, yeah, if you cheat on me, I am out. I would do the same thing. And I think it's easy for us to think when we think of sin, we're like, oh, that is never going to happen to me. I would never do that. And I think that is where the devil creeps into our heart when we think, well, this is cover, like that's not going to happen. That's when we are the most vulnerable.
That's the danger, right? Really, is when you say, I would never do that. That's when Satan's like, hold my purse. Like, that's really like, we shouldn't do that, right? We really have to say, okay, to be really ready, you say, this is possible, and these are the guardrails I'm going to put in. So I have a hedge of protection. Instead of like, here's a line that you could dance on, dance off, dance over, you're planting a hedge in front of that line. And so even if you get close to it, you hit this giant bush and you're like, oh, let's not go over there. So it's just really creating those systems for yourself, whatever they may be. And for me, I had to do things for years, and I still do it in many ways. We talk about like women's events, like the majority of my events, and even until very recently, I didn't do anything that was a mixed company. Working I did, but like if I traveled anywhere, if it was like a mixed gender situation, I'd say, we're going, Brian, let's go together. But I would just say no to anything that was traveling that included men. So I would only go with women. So it was women's ministries or women retreats, or even when I like went away. And I'm one of those people that actually need solitude, like time on my own. Part of my, when we talk about the rule of life, in my rule of life, I need time by myself. But there was a long time that I had to not do that. I had to figure out a different way, because I would use that time to get away with the guy I was having an affair with. So I've lost that privilege, and you have to understand that with your choices, there are consequences to those, right? And so I see a lot of couples that one's just over it. Usually it's the offender that's over it and is like, Brian and I coach couples, and they're just like, well, why can't they just get it? Why can't she get over it? Why can't he just get over it? I'm like, you kind of messed the whole thing up. Like, you can't just expect them to trust you immediately, because you've not built any walls of trust back up for them, right? And so that's the one thing, like integrity, you either have it or you don't. It's not like a sliding scale. So once you lose it, it's so much hard to build it back. But when you've built it back, you better work really hard to not mess it up again.
Yeah, I think that's so important what you said of building hedges and boundaries. We have a 12-year-old daughter. So even when I use that word boundaries, she's like, well, what do you mean by that? So having people in your life to help you understand, like, well, maybe this should be the point for you. Did you have anyone during that time really investing in you, coming alongside you, saying, hey, let me help you. Let me walk through this with you?
Yeah, we did. So they're really good friends of ours now, Justin and Trisha. So they were, I think 4 years ahead of us. We were at a conference and we met them and we're like, oh man, they're so cool. And we sat down for dinner and Justin just came out and was just like, oh, I had an affair 4 years ago. And it was with Trisha's best friend, all within the church. And he was like, I almost lost my whole marriage. And so in them telling their story, I was like, oh my gosh, there's hope in this. Like, I've never seen a couple make it. And so that was what shifted. And they were new friends of ours, but they became close very, very quickly because of the situation, obviously. When I heard that story that night, Brian and I heard it, that was the night that I confessed to Brian, because I was like, I got to take care of this now. We got to do this. And Trish walked with me and Justin walked with Brian. And we had friends that a lot of them actually kind of abandoned us. And I think a lot of it is in church world, you don't know how to deal with messy. And it's not anyone's fault. We just weren't raised in the theology of what happens when things get messy, even though Jesus was in the midst of messy all the time with people. So it was just a lot of people abandon us. A lot of people, because it was a pastor, they think that you've wronged them, even though the sin wasn't against you. I remember someone saying that to me and I was like, you are not Brian. That's weird. But when I could step back from it, I'm like, no, I understand that. Like, I can see why. Also, that's the danger of putting anyone on a platform, right? So let's just not do that. So Justin and Trisha, we had friends. Cindy Beale is a very close friend of mine. Similar situation. Her husband was a pastor, is a pastor still, and he had an affair and there was a child that came out of it. And so all of us had these similar stories and we kind of came out around the same time and there was a close knitness. So there was a handful of people that prayed for us, checked in on us, stayed with us. I think I was disappointed at how small that crew was compared to what I thought in my mind when you think you have community. But I also am at the same time so incredibly grateful that we had anybody, those people that were willing. That's your ride and die. So those are the people that I try to be that for people now. And I can't for everybody, but I think you can pick and choose like who your inner circle is and really make sure you're someone for somebody.
Jenni, you talked about how it's hard for us to deal with the messy. How can we do that for people in our life rather than just completely retract?
I think it comes back to it's very black and white, very right and wrong for us. And I think we have lost, if we even ever had this skill of being able to ask anything and disagree freely and then to love regardless. I think you have to be willing to lean in to ask the questions that seem really uncomfortable. I remember when I was in my affair, there was one person that later on came out and said, I felt like something was off and I didn't say anything. And they actually apologized. They're like, I should have said something to you. And I was like, no, it's not your fault. But then in hindsight, I thought, what if they had said to me, hey, what's going on with you and this guy? Would that have changed? And so I don't know if it would have, but I also think that if there's discernment in your heart, that's from the Holy Spirit. Like you, as someone you care about, say something and just trust that God's got it. They may not respond well. That has nothing to do with you. It may change their life for the better. So you don't know. Your job is to just act in obedience and be willing to make things uncomfortable. But I think where we lose it is sometimes people are really, really willing to make it messy, really just like aggressive and like in your face about things. And a lot of it is like they almost want to blow stuff up and just leave. And that's not the right way to do it either. And so you have to be willing. If you're going to blow things up, you got to be willing to stick around and help with the cleanup. And so that's the hard part. People aren't willing to do that. People are like, oh, you're too messy. You're too hard. You're too difficult. You're so extra. Well, how did they get there? What was our part in that? And I'm not saying our, like you specifically. I'm saying our as humankind. So we just got to love better. We got to be better at not only holding people accountable, but like loving them truly through it.
Yeah, the proximity of being with somebody just helps us understand, because you could take it at just what is happening on the outside. But really, I love to dig down deep. Maybe like what happened to get to create this? What were they struggling with? And those are the parts that we don't really get to hear or understand because we just kind of glaze over, or we're just like, oh, that's horrible. And then walk away. For my daughter, for quite some time, something happened and she says, well, I can't help it that you're always perfect, Mom. And I'm like, okay. So I remember I had to really be more intentional about saying, hey, here's how I messed up today. Here is how, this went wrong, or I tried to control this and this didn't happen, because I don't want that picture for our kids, because we are all human. So I want you to know that here's what's happening with me.
I mean, my kids know our story, because Chance was 3 and Paxton was 4 months old. And Chance is old enough to be like, Mommy's crying a lot. Daddy is crying a lot. It's just different, right? And so we made a choice to tell them early on what was going on, age appropriately, of course. And so our kids know that we mess up on the regular. And something growing up for me, and my parents never said that they were sorry. And some of it's cultural. They never said, I love you. They shared that they loved us by actions, but we still need to hear it. So I'm very intentional about telling my boys that I love them. I'm very intentional saying, I am so sorry. Mommy was wrong, and this is how I was wrong. Will you forgive me? And you don't have to forgive me right now, but I'm asking your forgiveness and when you're ready. And just giving them that choice to have those feelings and respond that way is super, super important as parents. So.
Yeah, I think, the messiness no one wants to touch, but it is so authentic to me. And I guess I'd rather just work through it, and talk about it, because it just feels more real, rather than I've walked into many small groups or different rooms and everyone's like, it's great. Everything's perfect. It's good, because we're not going to tell anyone. So yeah, I think that's so important. So thank you for that, Jenni. Just kind of switching gears here. You said that you were a self-professed nerd when it came to the Bible. Have you always been someone who has just loved to dive into the Bible, or is that something that has grown over time for you?
Oh man, I remember the first time I really started diving in. I was maybe 14, 15, 16, which makes me wonder where I went wrong with my kids. My kids don't even know how to work a Bible because they have YouVersion. And so they just like type it in and it like shows up. And I'm like, maybe you should learn where those things are in the Bible. So I parent well in some ways and clearly not in this area. I remember reading Revelation and feeling afraid. And I thought, why? I had enough in me to understand, okay, I'm afraid, but why would I be afraid of something that God put in here for me and God loves me, right? And so instead of avoiding it or just being like, I want nothing to do with it, I actually just dove in. And so I got all the study guides that I could, and some of them were great and some of them were terrible. And I just like started weeding through where I could connect things with this even before I knew that it was written in different languages. This is like how interesting my childhood was. I thought it was always written in English, whatever. The whole Jesus was white was real for me. I really thought that. This is the best part, Danielle. I went to a Chinese church. So like white Jesus on the wall. And I'm like, hey, what's up? So I don't know. Like that's just like reality for me, And so just trying to figure all that out. So I think the nerdiness started then. And I think part of it too is as time went on, as a minority female and kind of looking in the room and realizing there's that imposter part of me, I was truly kind of taken aback of like, okay, I just need to work harder. I need to do whatever I need to do to earn myself a place at this table. And whether that's right or wrong, I did the work. I continue to do the work. And I will say things that I've written, someone said to me, you should write a book. And I'm like, that's a bad idea. Because things that I've written, even just like devotionals that I've written, and I look back 5 years ago, I'm like, man, what was I saying? That is so wrong. That's theologically so questionable. So I just kind of don't ever want to write a book because I don't want anyone to be like, you said this. And I'm like, you're right. And I was wrong. So I think we need to have that posture of we've not arrived. We're just getting started. And so I think that's what feeds my nerdiness is that I have no idea. Like I'm teaching people and there is such a huge accountability in that. Anytime I'm on a stage, I make sure that my stuff is checked, double checked, triple checked in all the different languages and that I have commentaries. And it's not just all this one person says this or I found it in the internet. Like if you are on a platform, you better know your stuff and you better do the work and research it because people will take what you say and then they're going to change the words anyway. That always happens. I see it on social media. People will do some weird thing and they quote me and I'm like, I don't remember saying that. And sometimes I'm like, wow, that was really good. And then sometimes I'm like, I definitely would have never said that because like, I don't believe it, And so you just have to remember what you give to people has to be so right on and so very clear so that it's not taken out of context. So that was a very long answer to your question about my nerddom. But yeah, it's something that's always been with me. And a lot of it is just for my own hunger and me always having questions. My mom told me when I was a teenager, she's like, you're so rebellious. And I remember thinking I was rebellious. And then as I got older, she said it again to me at one point after I had my first son. And she's like, you were just so rebellious. And I said, can you tell me what was so rebellious? Because now I think back and I don't remember doing anything that was like I wasn't a bad kid, And she just asked a lot of questions. And I said, Mom, like that's not rebellion. That's just curiosity. And I get that you were tired as a single mom, but there should have been space for questions to be asked. And it's okay if you didn't know the answers, So we had a really good talk about that. And that was years ago. But I think having a space that you can ask questions, call it nerddom or whatever, being a nerdy, being whatever, but it just really, you should be asking questions. You should be saying, is this what this is about?
Yeah, I agree. It's so easy for us to take just whatever is on TikTok and completely believe that. We need to kind of dig deep into that. So it's so true, Jenni. It's really true. I would be curious, Jenni, if you could look back from your 8-year-old self through now, what would you tell yourself? What would you pour into that little girl?
Oh, that's so good, Danielle. That little girl that thought she could never fit in, that she would never be worth anything. I would tell that girl, just wait, because life does not end at 8, does not end at 9, does not end at 12. Your brain has not fully developed. I think for people, and I want to say this clearly, even not just a little girl in me, because I think our inner child still has the majority of the narrative in our life. And we have seen in post-pandemic, just a rise in suicide, a rise in depression, a rise in anxiety, a rise in discontentment and not knowing where you are because we had time to sit with ourselves. What I want to tell listeners out there is whatever you're feeling right now, that is today. It is not forever. And it might feel like a long time, but our lifetime, even if we lived to the time of Bible times, 500 years, whatever it was, that is just a blip on the radar. And our eternity, if we secure our eternity, that's what we're living for. We're living for God's kingdom and not for this world's empire. And so what are we caught up in? Are the things that are depressing us, that are making us anxious? Are they things that are going to fade away with time, with moths and rust? It's all going to be destroyed. What are we holding on to, and where does that matter?
Thank you so much for just sharing authentically today your own story and just giving us such hope and knowing that God restores us. He always is one who restores. And so I appreciate that. If people wanted to connect with you in any way, how can they find you on socials or wherever?
Yes, you can find me on social media. It's just J Clayville. So Twitter is J Clayville. Instagram is J Clayville. So is Facebook. Facebook, I'm the worst at. If you want to send me a message, I will probably not see it. Apologies in advance. I don't even know how to find it. TikTok, you know what? I have an account. Doesn't mean anything. I just am checking on my kids.
Oh, yeah. I know. I'm the worst. I told our daughter last night, I'm like, listen, like if I could just do a podcast and not have to promote anything and just people somehow found it, that would be fantastic. Yeah. So
I am also the worst self-promoter. Most of my, if you follow me on Instagram, it's just shenanigans. But you can find me. Just Google me. It's easy.
Well, Jenni, thank you so much for being on the Parable Podcast today. I'm grateful for Jenni sharing her parable story and just the authenticity and the honesty behind it. I mean, there is so much that each one of us have to walk through to figure out, what is the root? What is the reasoning behind our humanness, right? And so I just appreciate that and how God walks along with us. He does not want us to be isolated. He wants us to walk in integrity. And I'm just grateful that He is there each and every step of the way, and that people come into our lives and share things that, maybe we didn't see on the surface, but they share stuff that, gosh, it really resonates with us. It helps us better understand God's character and how He is working in each one of our lives. To learn more about Jenni, go ahead and visit DanielleZapchenk.com if you would like to also connect with her. For those of you that want to process through what Jenni said today, here are 2 takeaway questions. Number 1, how can you assess your life, your thoughts, and maybe set some guardrails or put up some hedges, just like Jenni said, in your life? What are the things maybe that draw you away from God, bring up some negativity when you are not your best self? What are those things? And so you can kind of figure out, hey, I need to set some boundaries in place here. Figure that out for yourself, because it is so beneficial as we continue and grow in our relationship with God. Number 2, how to deal with the messy. And I think there's 2 processes through that. One is sometimes we don't want to deal with the messy for ourselves. So trying to work through that, to step into that messy space for us. And number 2 is choosing to walk into that space with others. And like Jenni said, helping them clean up, not just like asking the question and then peace out, I'm out. Really being present with this person and helping them walk through it. Thank you so much for listening. You can subscribe wherever you listen, on Apple, Spotify, or even on YouTube, and you can leave a rating or review that really helps people find out about the show. And thank you so much to my technical producer of a husband, Eric, for editing this podcast. That is going to do it for today. I appreciate you spending time with me. Remember, your parable, it showcases God, who is constant. He is a trusted source of integrity. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.